know that the West decided to go for a long war. This was already confirmed back in the beginning of 2022 after the Russians invaded. What we learned from statements from Zelensky himself, he said that many countries in the West wanted a long war in Ukraine because this would give them a chance to bleed out the Russians, even if it meant the destruction of Ukraine. We had the two mediators, the Israel and Turkey, who confirmed also that, yes, the Russians and Ukrainians were close to a deal based on restoring Ukraine's neutrality, but the UK and US decided to continue and sabotage this so they can, effectively use this to bleed Russia. And as many other reports came out, the goal was then regime change in Moscow. This was seen as the only acceptable outcome. And ever since then, we've had formed narratives based on a long war. And the ultimate and most powerful narrative is that this was unprovoked. Because if it's an unprovoked war, that is, Russia is the new Hitler, or Russia wants to restore the Soviet Union, then in such a situation, peace can only mean to defeat the adversary, while negotiations means appeasement and defeat. So this is why you have the NATO Secretary General saying, or the former now, that weapons are the path to peace, and it's no point talking to the Russians because they just lie and they can't be trusted. This is all the long war narrative. But of course, there's many other smaller narratives, for example, suggesting that the Russians are taking many more casualties than the Ukrainians. This is also to mobilize support from our public to continue the war, because we're saying then, well, the Russians can be defeated if we just give it a little bit more time. And also, the Ukrainians aren't really losing that many men anyways. But if they were told the reality that the Ukrainians are being massacred, and also what our media doesn't want to show, how Ukrainians effectively are hunted on the street to be thrown into vans and shipped off to the front line. If we show this on our TV screens, perhaps our public wouldn't want to support this war anymore. Maybe if we talked about the fact that the majority of Ukrainians want negotiations, then standing with Ukraine in terms of rejecting peace and fighting on doesn't really make any sense. So everything we do is now hardwired for a long war. And I think this is the main problem, because there is no pathway to victory. Whatever victory over the world's largest nuclear power might have looked like, there is simply no path anymore. And I think that's why a key problem now is that I think we got trapped by our own narratives. That is, what are you going to do here in Europe? All our politicians said that this was Hitler. Once it's finished with Ukraine, well, we said two things. That is, Ukraine has to be a part of NATO because Russia would never dare to attack a NATO country. But we're also saying that once Russia's done with Ukraine, they will attack NATO. So it's everything is contradictory. Nothing really makes sense. One day we're saying the Russians are completely backwards, so we have to really be able to fight. The next day they're prepared and capable of conquering all of Europe. So it's all nonsense. It's a bit like listening to Trump. Don't listen to everything exactly what he's saying, but why he's saying it. And I think the same applies to the Europeans at the moment.
Yeah, let's get to the why. And that's what, I don't know if it's confused me, but I find it interesting is, why was this conflict in the first place? It doesn't seem like, we should be involved in any ways other than that there's a financial aspect. It doesn't seem like, it just seems like a great loss of life, and it's just to perpetuate, either the military industrial complex in the West, or just, to be quite frank, some money laundering scheme from politicians, if you would. That seems the why, because it doesn't seem like it should concern us in any way. And why, again, other than just we have to have a villain in all this, why is the Western media painting Russia in such a bad light when it seems like Ukraine? And just to give you a background, I have family in Central and Eastern Europe. And before this whole started, and even to this day, their opinion is that is the most corrupt country, if you're going to take a country in Europe, if you would. So that was their question. Why are we even involved? So, yeah. Can you answer that if you know what I'm saying?
Well, I think the Ukraine war has many sources behind it, but the main thing is I think it's a symptom of a collapsing world order. Keep in mind that when the Cold War came to an end, the main idea was we're going to create what the Gorbachev had called a common European home. That is an inclusive European security system. Even in 1990, we signed agreements such as the Charter of Paris for a New Europe. The whole thing was based on indivisible security. So one side should not expand its security at the expense of another. We're going to have a Europe without dividing lines, so overcome the bloc politics of the Cold War. However, as we already saw around 94, Russia was getting much weaker. And by the way, that time in early 94, even President Clinton argued that expanding NATO would redivide the continent and recreate the logic and conflicts of the Cold War. So this was very much well known. You see, but then Russia became weaker and weaker, and the main idea was why do we need to take their security into consideration at all? Sorry, because instead this idea came forth that instead let's create not a security system where we have to take into account the security of our opponents, but instead a hegemonic security architecture. There's a Pax Americana or unipolarity, global primacy. A lot of this was built also into the US security strategy at the time. Now, in terms, if you want a system based on global primacy, how that translates into a European security architecture is one of a collective hegemony. Then you have to maintain the alliance systems. If you maintain the alliance systems, then the Europeans will be dependent and Russia will be contained and weakened. So this was more or less the system went forward with. Keep in mind that the US Secretary of Defense, William Perry, he even pointed out back then that this was a huge mistake. He considered quitting the Clinton administration. And he also recognized, everyone in the administration recognized this would provoke conflict with Russia. But nonetheless, the main idea was it doesn't really matter what Russia thinks, they're getting weaker anyways. So why have a security system? We have to take them into consideration. Let's instead go for full dominance. And that meant we'll be so powerful and Russia will be surrounded by NATO anyway. So if it doesn't care for it, it doesn't really matter. Now, within this context, the main problem, the ultimate red line, and by the way, these are the words of the former CIA director, William Burns. He said the ultimate red line, the reddest of all red lines, would be Ukraine. And he very correctly predicted that this would trigger a civil war and the Russians would reluctantly invade because this was seen as an existential threat to the Russians. So, and the Europeans knew this all along. I mean, Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, once called this that Ukraine and NATO would be seen as a declaration of war. So the unprovoked narrative is just based on, it's false, just playing on the ignorance of people and being able to do so because of a very dishonest media who would just want to play ball rather than actually report on reality. So of course, many countries in Eastern Europe, they were quite happy about this as well because, under the Cold War and even before, Russia has not always been, an angel either. If you live on the border to a great power, you have your sovereignty violated quite often. Of course, this is also true in Central America, but also Russian neighbors. If I lived in Poland or Latvia, I would probably also want to be part of an anti-Russian military bloc. That is, instead of having a Europe without dividing lines, I would want to have the dividing lines moved closer to Russia and rather be on the other side. This is effectively the direction we went. And this is despite the fact we knew this would likely trigger a war. And also, by the way, when we toppled the government in Ukraine to pull Ukraine into our orbit, only about 20% of Ukrainians actually wanted to join NATO. That's another narrative, by the way. The fact that we argue that Ukrainians just wanted to escape the shadow of Russia and join NATO, this was not true until 2024, when we toppled the government, recreated the government, that is who should be in the government. Also from the first day after the coup, began to rebuild the entire Ukrainian intelligence services to have, because the ones who were there before the coup, they were very pro-Russian, liked the Ukrainian population, and then we replaced it with our own, as the New York Times said on the Washington Post, built up our own Ukrainian intelligence services, which were anti-Russian to the core. So this has been going on for a while, and all the evidence is there. It's just that the media doesn't report on actual facts anymore. It's quite concerning, especially in Europe. At least in the US, you get sometimes articles from the New York Times or Washington Post. In Europe, it's full conformity to the NATO narrative.
Yeah. So that leads me then to where exactly are we now? And that means in March 2025. Um, is this a complete collapse of obviously you just said it's a complete collapse of Ukraine. How is that going to be sorted out with regards to the US and also the rest of Europe? And where does this leave NATO, if you would?
Well, that's the great question, because NATO again was a manifestation of the hegemonic era.